I was smiling for the cameras, champagne in hand, when my mother-in-law leaned in and whispered, "Gold digger." The words sliced deeper than the diamond ring on my finger. I swallowed, posed, pretended it didn't matter. But later that night, I overheard her on the phone, planning to expose me on national television. She didn't know my name was already on another list, the kind that made bankers stand up when you entered the room, the kind that would make her choke when she saw it scroll across the news ticker, right under the words, "Top 10 Self-Made Millionaires." The wedding looked like something out of a lifestyle magazine. Crystal chandeliers rained light over gold-draped tables, a string quartet played in the corner, and my veil shimmered under the camera flashes. Daniel stood beside me, proud, handsome, the perfect husband in every sense. And then there was Margaret, his mother, offering me a small velvet box. Inside lay a platinum hairpin shaped like a crescent moon, studded with pearls so lustrous they almost glowed. "It's a family heirloom," she said, her voice sweet enough for the microphones. But her eyes, sharp, assessing, told me it was more than a welcome gift. I thanked her, sliding it into my hair, unaware of how symbolic it would become. For the first month, everything was smooth. I played the role of the perfect wife, hosting dinner parties, smiling through charity events, learning the subtle politics of the Prescott family. It was at one of those dinners, the kind where everyone wore diamonds and spoke in low, deliberate tones, that I heard the first crack. Margaret, seated across the table, swirled her wine and looked directly at me. "Emily, darling, I hope Daniel's finances aren't too intimidating for someone with a modest background." Her tone was almost playful, but her words landed like glass shattering. The other guest chuckled softly as though it were a harmless joke. I smiled, keeping my posture elegant, but my gaze hardened for just a second. After dinner, I excused myself to the study. That's when I heard her voice through the half-open door. "She's not like us," Margaret was saying into the phone. "Give it time. She'll regret walking into this family." My fingers tightened around the edge of the doorframe. I could have walked in, confronted her, but I didn't. Not yet. I had learned long ago that silence can be sharper than any outburst. Years earlier, before Daniel, before this grand house and these carefully orchestrated dinners, I had been the CEO of a small but ambitious AI company. We built something no one else had, and when a tech giant came knocking with a buyout offer, I took it. $50 million wired into my account overnight. It was enough to disappear from the business world, to reinvent myself far from the spotlight. I thought I had left power games behind, but Margaret was pulling me right back in. It started small. I noticed her making casual inquiries about my career history to Daniel's friends, discreetly asking if I'd ever been in serious debt. She was careful, never direct, but her interest was obvious. Then one morning over coffee, Daniel mentioned that his mother would be appearing on Real Conversations, a nationally televised talk show. "They're doing a segment on protecting wealthy families from opportunists," he said, hesitating on the last word. I stirred my coffee, my face unreadable. "Sounds enlightening." That evening, I did some quiet digging. The segment was indeed framed around dangerous women who married into money. My photo wasn't on the teaser, but Margaret's was, seated elegantly in a navy suit, hands folded like a judge about to pass a sentence. She was going to use the platform to paint me as one of them. 2 days later, as I was reviewing a charity proposal in the library, the phone rang. The caller ID was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was crisp, professional. "Ms. Prescott, this is Laura from Real Conversations. We'd like to invite you as a surprise guest for our upcoming episode. You'd be on stage with your mother-in-law, Margaret Prescott." For a brief second, I imagined her face when I walked out under the stage lights. The shock, the scramble to hide it. My lips curved slightly. "I'd be delighted," I said. The morning after the invitation call, I made sure Margaret would see what I wanted her to see. I sat at the breakfast table, hair slightly unkempt, no makeup, bills spread out like battlefield casualties. When Daniel walked in, I sighed heavily and muttered, "I might need to find some part-time work, just to ease things." Margaret's head tilted, the faintest flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. "Oh dear, that's responsible of you," she said, with the condescension of someone congratulating a child for cleaning their room. I let the moment hang. Let her imagine I was sliding down the slippery slope of dependency. That afternoon, I left the Prescott estate and drove to the city under the pretense of job hunting. Instead, I met Claire, an old friend from my startup days, now a respected investigative journalist. She wore her hair shorter than I remembered, her voice still sharp, but her eyes held that restless hunger for the truth. We caught up over coffee, and when I mentioned Margaret's upcoming talk show appearance, her brows knit. "You know I'm working on a piece about fraudulent charities, right? Prescott Family Foundation is on my list." I leaned back, playing the part of the reluctant confidant. "Interesting, but why would a respected foundation be under investigation?" Claire smirked. "Because they're funneling money to shell companies, and if I find the right source—" Her gaze locked on mine. I didn't commit, not yet, but I left with her number in my phone and a seed firmly planted. Back home, while Margaret thought I was combing through job boards, I logged into my encrypted investment accounts. 3 tech companies, one in renewable energy AI, another in cybersecurity, and the third in next-gen medical devices, were quietly thriving under my silent backing. My stakes in each were substantial, enough to give me leverage when the time came. The leverage came sooner than I expected. 2 weeks later, I was at the gym when the TV above the treadmill switched to CNBC. The anchor's voice cut through the morning noise. "Our list of top 10 female self-made millionaires of the year has just been released. At number 3, Emily Prescott, former tech CEO, now investor in multiple cutting-edge startups." My photo filled the screen. By the time I returned, Daniel was pacing in the study. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" I smiled faintly. "Because, dear, it didn't matter. Until now." Margaret avoided me at dinner that night, which was almost a relief, but the next morning she was back in form, lips pursed, eyes bright with controlled fury. "You've been busy," she said, "but money doesn't buy class, Emily. Remember that." I thanked her for the reminder and went upstairs to make my next move. If she wanted to play the public game, I would play the private one. I began acquiring shares of Kingswell Industries, the biggest competitor to Prescott Holdings. I moved quietly through intermediaries, ensuring my name wouldn't surface until I owned a significant enough block to matter. One afternoon, while reviewing the transaction reports in a downtown office I kept secret, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Henry Cole," the voice said. "I used to advise Margaret Prescott before she decided she didn't need me anymore. I hear you're buying Kingswell shares. I think we should talk." We met in a discreet cafe. Henry was older, with the weary look of a man who'd played too many games and lost one too many times. But his memory was sharp and his grudge against Margaret sharper. "She ruins people who don't fall in line," he said, "but she's sloppy when she thinks she's untouchable." He slid a manila folder across the table. "These are her last 2 charity transfers. They went straight into an offshore account she controls." I didn't touch the folder yet. "And what do you want in return?" "Just a front row seat when she falls," he said, smiling thinly. We shook hands. The timing couldn't have been better, because the very next day a whisper campaign began. Rumors circulated that I was undermining Daniel's business ventures to weaken Prescott Holdings. Margaret didn't confront me directly. She preferred to let the poison seep in slowly. Daniel tried to dismiss it at first, but I saw the doubt in his eyes. That doubt was Margaret's handiwork. That evening, as I was closing my laptop, an email arrived from an untraceable address. No subject line, just an attachment labeled Listened MP3. Against my better judgment, I clicked. Margaret's voice filled the room. "We'll make it look like she's been misusing company funds. File the lawsuit in Daniel's name, and she'll be forced to defend herself or walk away. Either way, she's gone." I sat back, letting the venom in her words sink in. It wasn't just a threat anymore. It was a plan. Daniel found me in the library late one night, his tie loosened, a glass of whiskey in hand. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it as though he was holding the world at bay. "I knew you had money," he said without preamble, "from the very beginning." I didn't look up from my book. "And you didn't think to tell your mother?" He shook his head. "I wanted to see how she'd treat you if she thought you had nothing. I guess I have my answer now." I set the book down and studied him. His expression was unreadable, part guilt, part admiration, and part something else I couldn't quite name. "Then you also know," I said, "that she's been trying to push me out." "I know," he admitted, "but you should also know she doesn't lose easily." I smiled faintly. "Neither do I." From that night, the rules changed. I no longer simply reacted to Margaret's moves. I made my own. The first step was feeding her information she couldn't resist. Through Henry Cole, I leaked a tip about a rare land development deal in South Florida, a supposed gold mine that would be available for a limited time. I made sure it was wrapped in enough authenticity, legal documents, projected returns, even fake city council meeting notes to lure her in. Predictably, she pounced. Within 2 weeks, she was sending over legal teams to secure the deal. The catch was buried deep in the fine print. The holding company managing the property was a shell corporation, registered overseas, under a chain of entities that ultimately led to me. I watched the contract come back, signed in Margaret's precise handwriting. One flourish of her pen had transferred millions in liquid assets directly into my control. The moment was almost too easy. But I knew it was just the opening move. The very next morning, headlines blared across the business networks. "Emily Prescott seizes control of key Prescott Holdings asset." Reporters camped outside the estate, cameras flashing every time I stepped to the window. The narrative was swift and merciless. I was portrayed as a cunning opportunist who had manipulated her way into the family fortune. At first, I assumed Margaret was behind it. But then I saw the leak's origin, an anonymous tip traced back to an IP address registered to Daniel's office. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. "You put my mother in a corner," he said flatly. "I had to protect her, and if I benefit too, well, that's just the way the game works." It was the first time I saw the Prescott blood in him. Cold, calculating, ready to cut away anything that threatened the dynasty. The press frenzy escalated. Every detail of my life was suddenly public property. My investments, my charity work, even the address of my childhood home. Margaret, of course, remained the picture of wounded dignity, telling reporters she hoped for reconciliation. But inside the house, the war was open. Staff avoided eye contact, whispers followed me down hallways, and Daniel barely spoke to me except in clipped, logistical exchanges. I focused on fortifying my position. I secured the assets transferred through the Florida deal, moving them into diversified holdings where neither Daniel nor Margaret could touch them. At the same time, I began working with Claire, the journalist, to ensure the truth about the Prescott Foundation's activities would surface at the right moment. 3 weeks after the leak, I came home to find a courier waiting in the foyer, a large envelope in hand. The staff didn't meet my eyes as I signed for it. Inside were neatly typed legal documents, a formal summons to appear in court, naming me as a co-defendant in a civil suit. The plaintiff? The Prescott Family Foundation. The allegations: fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. And there, in smaller type, was the name of the other defendant, Margaret Prescott. For a moment, I just stared at the page. The absurdity of it was almost laughable. Margaret had managed to drag herself into the legal crossfire she'd prepared for me. But as the weight of it settled, I realized this wasn't a victory. This was escalation. By tying me to her in a public legal battle, she had ensured my reputation would sink or swim with hers. If she went down, she'd make sure I was chained to her all the way to the bottom. I folded the summons carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and looked out the tall windows toward the city's skyline. The game had changed again. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and tension. Cameras were everywhere, hidden in the pens of reporters, glaring openly from the press box, glinting in the eyes of the public seated in the gallery. Margaret sat 2 chairs away from me at the defense table, her navy suit impeccable, her hair in a perfect chignon. Daniel sat beside her, jaw tight, the loyal son and co-strategist. When the judge called the case, the prosecution began its parade of accusations. I let them build their version of the story, how I had supposedly siphoned funds, manipulated contracts, and compromised the Prescott empire. Then, when the moment came, I stood. "Your Honor," I said, "I'd like to enter new evidence into the record." From my briefcase, I pulled a thick folder, months' worth of quietly gathered transactions, offshore transfers, and email chains between Margaret, Daniel, and their network of shell companies. I explained each one clearly, methodically, letting the numbers and signatures speak louder than my voice ever could. The gallery shifted, whispers rising like static. Daniel's face paled first, then flushed an angry red. Margaret's hands tightened in her lap, knuckles blanching. But the real shock came from the back of the courtroom. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped forward, flanked by 2 attorneys. The judge allowed him to speak, and he introduced himself as Gregory Holt, chairman of Holt International Finance. 2 years ago, Holt began. My company was on the brink of collapse. Mrs. Prescott refused to help, though she could have. Mrs. Emily Prescott, however, provided a loan under strict anonymity, on the condition it be repaid without publicity. I'm here to confirm her role and to state that my team has verified every piece of evidence she's presented today. The room was electric. I could feel the weight of the cameras turning toward me, searching for my reaction. I kept my gaze steady on the judge. It was over within the hour. The judge ruled for an immediate investigation into the Prescott Family Foundation and issued provisional seizure of its assets. As Margaret and Daniel rose from their seats, 2 uniformed officers approached. The cuffs clicked around their wrists just as the court cameras zoomed in, and for the first time, Margaret's perfect composure cracked. "Emily," she hissed as they led her away, "you think you've won, but you haven't." I didn't respond. The flash of bulbs followed them out the door, the image already destined for every evening broadcast in the country. In the days that followed, the Prescott empire began to splinter. Stock prices dropped, partners withdrew, charities severed ties. Margaret's name, once synonymous with influence, became a byword for scandal. I was in my private office one late evening when my assistant announced a visitor. The man who walked in was tall, silver-haired, with the kind of presence that filled a room without trying. "Emily," he said, his voice carrying a strange mixture of warmth and formality. "It's been a long time." I stared at him, and then the pieces fell into place. I had seen his photograph once, years ago, hidden in the back of my mother's closet. My father, the man who had vanished from my life when I was 14. He explained it quickly, how he'd built his own fortune, how he'd kept tabs on me from a distance, how he'd waited for the right moment to step in. And now, he said, that moment had come. "You and I," he said, "we could dominate the market together. The Prescott void leaves room for new leadership. With my reach and your precision, we could be unstoppable." But there was something in his eyes, an eagerness that felt uncomfortably familiar. "I'll think about it," I said. We moved to his desk to review preliminary documents. That's when I saw it. Half hidden beneath a stack of papers, a contract bearing 2 signatures, his in bold black ink, and beneath it, Margaret Prescott. I froze, the weight of it sinking into my chest. I told myself I would think about my father's proposal, but in truth, I was already playing the part. Within weeks, I was attending board meetings in his stead, negotiating deals with the same precision that had once kept my own startup afloat. Only now the stakes were larger, whole industries shifting with a single signature. Somewhere along the way, my decision-making changed. I stopped asking how each move would affect the people around me and started calculating only the profit margin, the strategic gain. The empathy I'd once worn like armor began to feel like a liability. One morning, Robert Lane, my most loyal analyst, came into my office. He'd been with me since my early tech days, the kind of employee who would work through the night without being asked. "I'm hearing whispers," he said quietly, "about the merger with Delmont Corp. They're going to shut down the entire R&D wing if this goes through." "They're bleeding cash," I replied, barely looking up from the report in front of me. "That wing employs over 200 people," he pressed. "Some of them moved their families here for those jobs." I met his gaze, feeling the faint sting of something, remorse maybe, but I pushed it aside. "It's a necessary move, Robert. We can't keep dead weight." The next week, the merger was finalized. The layoffs hit the news within hours. Robert didn't come back to the office. I heard later he'd lost his home, that his wife had taken their children to live with her parents out of state. The first sleepless night came then, though I didn't admit it to anyone. I buried myself deeper in work, thinking I could outrun whatever shadow was creeping in. But shadows have a way of finding you. It was in my father's study during a late meeting that I saw it. A framed photograph on the wall, half obscured by the edge of a curtain. My father, decades younger, smiling at a formal dinner table. Beside him, Margaret, wearing the same expression I'd seen her use when sealing a deal. I stepped closer. "When was this taken?" He didn't look up from his desk. "Before you were born, back when your mother still thought I'd change." The truth clicked into place like a lock turning. "You and Margaret—" "We were business partners," he said flatly. "The Prescott Lane venture. Your mother's company was collateral damage." I stared at him. "Collateral damage? You destroyed her." His eyes finally met mine, and there was no apology in them. She was in the way. So are most people. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. The urge to step back, to put distance between us, was overwhelming. The next day, the pieces started aligning too perfectly. The anonymous emails, the conveniently timed evidence, the introductions to allies who hated Margaret just enough to help me. It had all been orchestrated. I confronted him in the conference room of a high-rise downtown, the city spread out like a chessboard behind the glass. "It was you," I said. "Every move, every leak, it came from you." He leaned back in his chair, a small smile on his lips. "You needed a push, and Margaret needed to be taken down. I simply arranged for your paths to cross in the right way." "You used me," I said. "I gave you power," he countered, "and you used it better than anyone I've ever seen." For a moment, I almost believed him. Almost. The next week, I came into my office to find it stripped bare, files gone, accounts inaccessible. A courier arrived an hour later with a single envelope. Inside was a notarized document transferring liability for a series of defaulted loans, totaling just over $30 million, directly to me. There was no note. No explanation. But there didn't need to be. My father had vanished, and he had left me holding the bill. The debt sat on my desk like a living thing, breathing down my neck every time I tried to think. $30 million. My father's final gift. Margaret's shadow still in the air. And for the first time in years, I had no appetite for the game. I spent 3 nights without sleep, pacing my apartment, looking out over the city lights, all the skyscrapers, all the polished boardrooms, all the late-night strategy calls. What had they left me with? A hollow empire and a name heavy with scandal. By the 4th morning, I knew what I had to do. I began liquidating everything, shares, properties, offshore accounts I'd once sworn I'd never touch. Every cent went into a single purpose. The Horizon Fund, a foundation for women entrepreneurs with big ideas and no backing. My lawyers thought I was insane. The press thought I was staging a publicity stunt. The business world thought I was finished. I didn't care. The invitations rolled in anyway, Offers to sit on boards, to helm new ventures, to merge with companies that wanted my name as a shield. I declined them all. I was done with playing someone else's game. The first check I signed from the Horizon Fund went to a 23-year-old in Detroit with a prototype for solar-powered water filters. The next went to a team of women in Bangalore building low-cost surgical tools. Every approval felt cleaner than any deal I'd ever made. Weeks later, I came home late to find an envelope on my doorstep. No return address. The paper was thick, the handwriting deliberate. Thank you for saving my family. Signed, a former enemy. I stood there in the quiet hallway, the words sinking in. The list of people who might write such a note was long, and every name carried a story of betrayal, reversal, or uneasy alliance. But for the first time, I didn't need to know which one it was. Months passed. The fund grew beyond my own contributions, attracting investors who wanted to put their money where it could matter. We opened offices in New York, Nairobi, and Singapore. My days were spent meeting women whose ideas could change their communities, my nights reading proposals and sketching out ways to scale them. It was during one of those nights that the invitation came, an official letter from the United Nations, requesting that I speak at their annual assembly on women's economic empowerment. When I arrived in Geneva, the scale of it hit me. Diplomats, heads of state, NGO leaders from every corner of the world. And yet, when I stepped onto the stage, I wasn't nervous. I spoke about building something that wasn't measured by market cap or quarterly growth, but by lives changed. I spoke about the illusion of security in marrying into power and the reality of making your own. I spoke about losing everything and finding more than I'd thought possible. When I finished, the applause was immediate and sustained. Later, in the office of our New York headquarters, the platinum hairpin sat in a glass case, the same one Margaret had given me on my wedding day, its pearls still gleaming under the soft lights. Below it, a simple plaque. I did not buy love. I built my own worth. Visitors always stopped to look at it, some asking about the story. I'd smile, give them the short version. The long version was already living in every woman who walked out of our doors with a grant, a plan, and the confidence to use both. On the final day of the UN conference, I stepped outside into a sea of photographers. The air was cold, the kind that made you aware of every breath. The flashes erupted as soon as I appeared. I paused, letting the light wash over me, not as an ornament on someone else's arm, but as someone whose story had become her own currency. I smiled, not for them, but for myself, knowing that somewhere someone would hear it and know it could be theirs too.